So it's like, well, I can call an API, spin up this file, and then now say, hey, add it down. And now I was reading Terraform already has.
Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here today at Chef Conf, the conference for Chef, the company. We're in Chicago. We're at the Hyatt Hotel. I'm Alex Williams, founder and editor-in-chief of the New Stack. So we're recording an episode of the New Stack Makers here, sponsored by Chef. And one of the questions we're really asking is about Chef and their comprehensive suite of automation products. They have a whole line of automation products, as we well know. It runs infrastructure, runtime environments, application, even the DevOps workflow itself. And today we're speaking with Jonathan Weiss, Senior Software Development Manager at AWS,
exactly.
And Mark Rambow, Software Development Manager at AWS. Thanks for joining us for the show.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Hello. Thank you.
Great. One of the things I wanted to really ask you guys about is that, AWS really does embody this whole idea of DevOps in many ways. The whole concept of DevOps really, I think, emerged through cloud services, and I think primarily through the work that AWS has done in many respects. And so I'm curious about how do you still embody these DevOps ideals, these practices and processes that we're seeing more people adopt, that we're seeing more interest in. I'm just curious from that perspective, how are you evolving your DevOps practice?
So internally at Amazon, we pretty much still live these original ideas. As you said, we believe Amazon was a big part of bringing this up and also evangelizing to a degree customers about this. So we believe in what we call working backwards from the customer, which means we always try to start, here is the customer problem, how can we resolve that, how can we remove the friction for the customer and then work backwards to the technical problem. We always like to put then a dedicated team that is responsible for solving this problem. We call that the two pizza teams, right? Like a team that you can feed with two pizzas. And then that small group of people own solving this problem and kind of to bring the DevOps aspect in it. So that means defining the problem, designing the solution, implementing the solution, and then deploying, operating it, supporting it to a degree. So we still very much live this aspect. I think what you see, what changed over the past is that our tools improved, that I think a lot of what we used internally, like the ideas, we started externalizing and offer to customers, and also teach customers. A lot of customers are interested in how is Amazon doing this internally so that they can learn and kind of have this similar flexibility and agility.
So how have the tools improved?
I think something that we adopted a lot more is the idea also of serverless, and both internally and then offering externally for customers. This is a big trend that I think is there for the whole industry. I think automation is a big topic where the tools that we had years ago are obviously not as good as the tools that we have today, and I think you see that also in the offering that we have for customers. Code pipeline is a good example of automation and how we like to think of releasing code to production internally, and we think this is the right model for customers too. Serverless, API gateway, Lambda, those are obviously big trends for us.
So Mark, is that a gateway then? Is DevOps a gateway then to these new technologies that you're seeing?
So I think that the key point is that automation makes it more flexible so that you can be closer on what customers actually demand from you. If you don't have this automation, you can't be as fast responding to customer demands, right? And this is the whole movement from the cloud is you can get infrastructure very quickly, but what you do with that infrastructure, there's this little gap of, okay, everything needs to be set up, and this is where Chef actually shines, right? So you have this infrastructure as code, and at the end you can apply software development best practices to develop your infrastructure. So you have the code that defines the infrastructure, tested, automatically rolled out, deployed to production. And so it's not that you just get a server from EC2, for example, but you get everything set up so that your application is running. And that's the big point where Chef actually has a big leverage in the DevOps field.
Mm-hmm. So how do these practices then influence your own decisions and your own architectural decisions? AWS is famous for building their services on customer feedback, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at announcements, you need to think about that. You need to think about, okay, then there must have been a consideration here. So those architectural decisions that you're making about virtualization, for example, or container technologies, how are those changing? What are you seeing from customers that's affecting kind of your architectural decisions that you're making as you think more about these technologies that can just optimize resources more and more and more?
Yeah, as you were saying, we try to influence our decision making by the customer needs. So we talk a lot to customers, figure out what is it that they're trying to solve. How do we enable them to focus on their business problems? And then we try to model that into our architecture, our decision making, where again, we apply the same pattern also internally. Like if we think about building a service, building a product, we also want that team to focus on that particular problem that they're trying to solve, and not worry about servers, not worry about configuration, not worry about deployments, about testing. So we try to adopt also these best practices internally, right? And as you were saying, like virtualization, things like containers are like one way where you can have the developers of that product focus more on that. So we of course look very closely. Can we leverage these technologies internally, right? Can we use our own products to speed up the development process, and again to focus, as Mark was saying, more on what is the customer problem and how can we stay agile and not and nimble and no longer have to spend a lot of time in the heavy lifting. So basically the same promises we make to customers, like that we believe AWS platform is a great way so that you can focus more on your business problem, kind of the same patterns also you will see internally.
Mm-hmm. So those internal processes that you're building, there's almost like this inside-out effect, isn't there?
So I think Jonathan already mentioned that code pipeline, right? So this is something that we had internally for years. And we figured out, okay, people are very curious on how we build software, and then we externalized those products and made them available on AWS. And our aim is to make infrastructure effortless for customers, right? So when you go to the cloud, it's just a fingertip to get a new server or instances running that run even Docker containers. Deployments is a problem that is solved for customers. You don't have to come up with your own custom solutions for that. Most of the main use cases are solved already, and you can just use them. And we like to evangelize what we do internally to our customers so that they can benefit from the agilities that we live currently, so that they can adopt the same best practices. And I think the people that build services, they are very much in the customer shoes. They have the same problems, because software development, if it is outside of AWS or inside of the AWS, they have all the same problems to solve. Mm-hmm. And ideally, we have a solution found in Amazon that we can help customers to adopt on the outside as well.
Yeah, I think a popular kind of use case that we talk about a lot is our internal deployment, right? So in a sense, Amazon is also a big enterprise company that was historically also struggling from the same problems that customers are struggling today. Like, how can you quickly deploy changes from different teams without interference, without the fear that one team introducing a problem will cause problem for the world of other team software. So that's kind of how we started to develop Apollo, which is an internal deployment tool. And we then modeled on top of that learning, we modeled Code Deploy, which is the external product that we offer customers that allows them to quickly deploy changes and software to instances. And that means that internally, teams are much more decoupled and are able to roll out changes independently. And I think we publish the numbers somewhere. I don't have them out of the top of my mind, but like how many deployments are happening internally at Amazon at every given day, because we learned the lesson of you need to decouple the development teams and empower them to control their own destiny in terms of the architecture, in terms of the software, in terms of the process, in terms of the tools, and then we can provide them internally with a great platform that enables them to do that. And then we kind of stepped back and said, wait a minute, can't we kind of offer a similar platform to customers? And that's a lot of the learnings that you see from our tools and services that we release. We kind of started thinking we have this problem internally, so for sure customers can have the same problem, and then we talk to customers, get feedback, and so that's how those new ideas and new services start. And once we release a service, we're very eager to understand from customers how can we improve, what is the direction we should be following.
So tell us the example of the evolution of the container service that Amazon offers. How did that develop internally?
So the containers is a good example where we kind of listen to customer feedback, I think, right? Historically we had with EC2 kind of a classic service where you give us an image which is fairly big, right? Because it's a whole operating system and you can launch new instances with that. But then with the rise of popularity of Docker, where the tools are easier to use, and it's easy, and the containers are smaller, right? And more customers were asking for supporting that. There was always the possibility for customers to run Docker themselves on EC2, right? You can launch an EC2 instance, install the Docker daemon, and create a Docker cluster. But again, that's work, right? That you need to maintain the agent, and the Docker daemon. You need to maintain these instances. So the first release you saw from Amazon, ECS, right, was the first product where we said, wait a minute, we can make it easier for you to manage this cluster of instances that represent your kind of Docker infrastructure. Then again, we listened to feedback and we saw, hey, customers still need to maintain the actual container instance. They still need to launch additional capacity if they need more. They need to replace servers that maybe have issues. So that's why what you see was with Fargate and with EKS and so forth. You see also offerings where we say, why don't we also take that away from you? So that again, you can focus on your business problem. You can just say, here's my Docker container here that runs my application, and you no longer have to worry about actually managing the container instance.
So is Fargate an example of it's as I understand, Fargate's container native infrastructure? Did that come from then customer feedback saying that, or was that something you've been building internally to build more of a native infrastructure so you could then build what you're needing to get done to decrease that friction?
So I'm personally not exactly familiar with the history of that or conception of that particular idea, but usually it's kind of a mixture of both, right? You have internally, we have a big developer community who gives feedback and who says, hey, why is this still difficult? Or it would be great if we would have a way to easier manage this particular problem. And then there are external customers that give us hopefully similar feedback, because then it's easier for us to understand, okay, there's a clear trend here, and we see, does it make sense to offer something here? So that's kind of the typical way how these ideas start usually.
So, are container technologies helping drive DevOps efficiencies at all? I mean, are you seeing a difference in how we think about efficiencies when you're comparing, for instance, virtualized environments versus container technology environments?
I think the biggest difference when you look into containers is that developers, or in the DevOps community, developers had to think about the infrastructure as it's running, right? So, but actually they want to just build new software. They want to get new applications out there. And that's their day-to-day job, which is their main focus, right? And with containers, it got much easier to deploy them. So they could run them locally, you test them locally, and then you push them over, right? And then they run. But still, there was always the necessity to maintain the container ships, I would say, and the underlying infrastructure. Still, if you're an enterprise, you have some regulations that you need to apply here. You still want to patch those instances. You want to maintain them. You need to reboot them at some point in time, right? And that's where Fargate and EKS come into play and make things much easier for customers, because they don't have to take care of that part anymore. Mm-hmm. But if you have to, let's say you're maybe half on-prem, half in the cloud, you still need to maintain those instances, and this is where automation is coming in. And Chef has a lot of great tools to offer there to actually make sure that you're not running out of spec. So your compliance team might have a certain understanding of how that should run, what the security stance needs to be on those things, while your developers can just maintain the applications and don't have to think about that infrastructure so much anymore.
Right. Chef's an interesting story kind of in all this. They were almost as early as you guys, right? They've been around a while. They were one of the real kind of the principles behind the DevOps movement with their cookbook and their approach. And I'm curious about configuration management. I had this conversation yesterday, and I was saying there'll be pundits who are claiming configuration management's on its way out, right? It's getting abstracted, but that doesn't really seem to be true. I guess the question more is like for AWS, how's configuration management evolving as a practice?
Yeah, that's a great question, and like you say, I think it changed over time when configuration management and kind of Chef as a trend started. Like a lot more people use it to configure the on-instance software, right? Like, the two of us are actually from the Opsworks service where we partner with Chef and we embed Chef to help customers run their infrastructure. And the original service we launched, called Opsworks Stacks, embedded the Chef client and basically allowed customers to run Chef recipes on demand on an instance when a certain event happened, like the launch a new instance or the deploy software, and then you install the right version of Apache or make sure a certain file exists and so forth. It's kind of the traditional configuration management use case, if you like. And what we definitely saw over time that while this is still growing and still happening, because there's still a large number of people that are slowly now migrating from on-prem workloads to the cloud, where they haven't adopted configuration management yet, and they're starting to do that. But I think there is also a different trend where you use tools like configuration management to configure, for example, your Docker Kubernetes infrastructure, right? But somebody still needs to install, configure, and maintain Docker. Somebody still needs to make sure the right SSH keys are on the machine, the right Linux kernel version is there, or install a patch. And that's still a big use case, right? And that's not going away. And then I think recently we've seen also a lot more, as Mark was saying, around the compliance and security use cases. Inspec is a great example, Chef Automate, where I not only use those tools to put the configuration there in the first place, I also use it to ensure that it's there correctly, that there is no configuration drift, that I can quickly answer questions like which port is open where, like if there is a new security problem in a certain library, where do I have it installed, which service might be vulnerable, did my patch actually work, and so forth. And those questions are I think not going away as long as you will have servers. Obviously for somebody that adopts serverless, there might not be an immediate need, but even there they need to understand what is actually in my infrastructure portfolio, which versions of what software do I have running. I don't think this use cases will go away. So
from your experiences in terms of your history and understanding configuration management, for example, how is that now evolving with the advent of containers and more technologies that are intended to really decrease that friction?
So I think it is evolving so that it is focusing on what it's doing well, which is like configuring servers, like where you said that use case might be now only be applicable to potentially, like if you're full bought into Docker, for example, into a smaller team in your company, because often now you have the group of people that are actually installing, maintaining that Docker infrastructure for another team, for example. So that is still a use case, right? Or if you use other tools like ECS, AKS, Fargate, for example, you still need to build consistently and reliably and in a way to be able to reproduce it, that Docker image. You still want to know what software is in there. You still want to be able to reproduce it. You still want to be able to upgrade to a new operating system. You still want to document, how do I actually configure that? How do I reproduce it? How do I make sure that I can run it on the cloud, on my development system? How do I make sure that I'm compliant with regulations? How do I know that which version of which library am I running? So I think these use cases become more important, but I wouldn't say that first use case is kind of lost, if you like, right? I think that's still fairly relevant. That is more maybe not as hot anymore because it becomes standard practice. Doesn't mean that that's not important.
Yeah. I think there's one other point to it. So we talk a lot about Docker and so on, but there's a lot of traditional companies
Yeah.
that become software companies now. So
Yeah.
they have to adopt a lot of new
Right.
stuff, right? So when they start to think about how they can adopt Docker, they need to think about, okay, how can we get Docker, right? So they need to figure out, okay, we don't have any automation in place right now. We don't even have a good overview of what's running in our infrastructure. So they need to do kind of book checking, right? So they need to figure out what's running here, then trying to evolve from that and figuring out, okay, so how can we get some of our monolith applications somewhere to Docker?
Right.
And this is a hard part, right? So you can say, okay, can we Dockerize that application? Maybe, maybe not. And if we can't containerize it, we should at least have a good overview of, is it still compliant? Has all the patches been installed? Can we automate that process? And how can we evolve in that application model that we have to maintain for a long time because our customers still depend on it? And I think this migration from traditional companies that might have been, I don't know, a train company into kind of a software company that it's now, that offers value services over the internet. This is a huge transition that they have to do. And one thing that we see is that those companies migrate to the cloud because they have a lot of infrastructure still running that is not well automated, and it's much easier to do in the cloud. And the other thing is not everything can be Dockerized easily, and especially those old applications and monolithic applications still deserve to have a proper maintenance, and automation is key here. And Chef has great tools to do that. And the other part is you have great insights that you get from running Chef and automate and inspec, so that you can understand, okay, what do I run? How is it going? Is it compliant into certain regulations that evolve over time, right? So compliance requirements get more and more, especially with every incident that happens. There are new requirements that you need to adapt. And you need a tool that gives you the overview, and it gives you the tools to actually change your infrastructure to be compliant. And this is where it becomes more important for us. So it's not only that we talk about the 10% of the top-notch companies that are fully Dockerized, have everything Kubernetes and so on. There's a lot of people that need to adopt on that train and slowly getting into that.
And I think Mark touched on a great point here, right? Like if the famous legacy application, of which there exists a lot more than of greenfield applications. So these are usually way harder to get into something like Docker or Kubernetes or AKS or ECS, right? But it's easier to put them on an image and kind of replicate them with something like Chef, so that you're able to at least lift and shift them into the cloud, where you can run flexible workloads. You can benefit from things like auto scaling, even though you're not able to automate them as much as you would like to, right? Like so that's still like a very important use case, which again I think is becoming more and more important as more companies move on-prem workload to the cloud.
Mm-hmm. So Opsworks, I'd like to focus on Opsworks for a little bit. How, tell us what does Opsworks do? And then secondly, how is Opsworks being affected by the evolution of DevOps and the arrival of container technologies and these new automation capabilities?
Sure. So there are kind of two different flavors of Opsworks, if you like. So one, I was previously already talking about this, is Opsworks Stacks. That's kind of the original offering that we have, which is an application management service where we help you define kind of a blueprint for your application, and then you can define how many servers on EC2 should be running that, and we take care of, by leveraging the Chef client, configuring these and allow you to deploy new versions of your software and so forth. And there we use Chef 0 to do this configuration, but the Chef is a little bit more a means to an end to get the consistent configuration that you like, but ultimately it's about defining the holistic infrastructure and provisioning it with AWS. At reInvent 2016, we also launched Opsworks for Chef Automate, and Mark is probably the best person to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Opsworks for Chef Automate, we heard that customers like to run Chef in AWS, and with Opsworks Stacks, they always had the problem that it doesn't have a real Chef server, so it's not the real deal, and the community best practices were not easily going. But setting up a Chef server, especially including Automate, is a lot of work. So And we listened to our customers and said, okay, we can take that burden from you. If we give you something that you can start with 3 clicks, and that's completely configured, it's running in AWS, and you have it quickly running for yourself, and then we do all the maintenance afterwards. So we manage the server for you for the entire lifetime. So you don't have to be an expert in how to run a Chef server, and we just do it for you, and you just use it. So you get started quickly, and you can just focus on, okay, I need to write certain cookbooks and recipes. Most of them are already in the Chef supermarket, so you can just apply them to your infrastructure. So you can concentrate on what you actually want to achieve rather than, okay, how do I get there? And that helps a lot customers to actually adopt automation, and especially with the Automate platform, that gives you a lot of insights into your infrastructure, and that gives you a lot of flexibility on, okay, how can I run Chef? What is actually working well? Which of the cookbooks converged well and which had errors? So you can figure out, okay, half of my infrastructure didn't converge to that cookbook because I forgot something. You can see that immediately, you can react on it. And the second part is, with Chef compliance, this became a huge deal, right? So you can now use Inspect to actually report on if your infrastructure is compliant against the CIS profiles, the Center of Internet Security. And you can just scan all those nodes even without having Chef adopted. So even if you're not someone that wants to use Chef for configuration management, this compliance piece is super valuable. And with Automate, you can figure out, okay, which of my software I need to change to actually be compliant, so that when my next audit is coming up, I'm prepared. And you don't have to do the heavy lifting of figuring that out with the auditor together. You can be prepared, and that will make your experience a lot better.
Yeah. So basically, with that second flavor, we're focusing on operating a configuration management server for you, right? So we do support Chef Automate. Actually, last year we also added Puppet Enterprise. So we want to make AWS the best place to run configuration management and automation tools, and provide the customers with the tools they need. So we take care of backups, maintenance windows, operating system updates, version upgrades, a better integration with AWS in terms of registering new nodes. So that's what we do there. And then you ask, like, how did it evolve for us, especially with the aspect of containers? And I think what we've seen is very similar to the questions that you had earlier, where there are some customers who were now, a smaller team potentially is using it to operate containers, like a large fleet of container instances for their company, and then some developers in that company don't interface with that directly. They then talk to the Kubernetes or Docker APIs. So that's one kind of use case that we see. And then the other one, as Mark was mentioning, is the whole compliance, security, IT governance use case, where tools like Chef Automate and Chef Compliance are very important.
I'm coming up to kind of the end here, and I just wanted to ask kind of a last question about, how these architectural decisions, you see continuing to evolve with Chef in context with that, right? So, do you see that an increase in use for Chef? Or maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it's more like, how do you, the architectural kind of infrastructure you developed now up to this point, how do you see it evolving? How do you see it change? How do you see it changing? As customers get more sophisticated about what they're trying to do, we're starting to see some patterns change, right? We're starting to see purchasing decisions, potentially change by looking at cloud services more as a way for them to really kind of take advantage of those capabilities.
Yeah, so as you were rightly saying, I think it's not only technology, it's also other patterns that change, where ultimately customers want to be able to respond quicker to change, right? Like the one thing that is constant is change. Your customer requirements will change, your security requirements will change, the technology stack might change, but the need to be able to handle that change is always there. And what we see is that's why tools that help you to cope with that change become more and more important. And companies are investing more in automation and tools like Chef and like things like Code Pipeline and things like Kubernetes that just help you stay on top of that, right? So that, again, you are able to respond fast to that and solve ultimately the need that your customer has. And as you were saying, customers are getting more and more sophisticated. I think there is still a large cohort of customers that is still kind of learning and where they're still very early in that journey. But you have, of course, some early adopters who have been using Docker for a long time, and serverless is another, I think, big player out there where the abstraction is getting kind of higher and higher,
right.
So that again, you can focus on writing your business logic, if you like, but the certain requirements, like you still, with something like serverless, need to have fully automated release process that you're able to audit, that you're able to automate and monitor. That need is still there and is not going away. So having like a release chain that supports you in that, where you enable your individual development teams to release changes quickly, get customer feedback quickly, iterate quickly, understand how your application is behaving. That is definitely something that we see becoming more and more important, and that is constant, no matter if you haven't adopted configuration management yet, if you use containers or if you use serverless. I think you need to have a platform like that.
So Mark, just in conclusion, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think Jonathan really nailed it. But what I would like to add is with the need for automation, this will never go away, right? So all the tools that we built, Docker, Kubernetes, Chef, whatever you have, everything was with the aim to make it more effortless to run applications at the end, right? So you want to bring out software to your customers faster. And however you want to do it, you need to have automation so that you get that done fast. And any tool that can help, we are happy to support customers to use those.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking the time to speak with me. I've been joined by Jonathan Weiss and Mark Rambow with Amazon Web Services. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank for everyone for tuning into this episode of the New Stack Makers. It's sponsored by Chef. And as always, thanks for listening. And please subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcast from. Thank you very much.
Thank you.